I don't like puzzles in D&D. Or at least how they're normally portrayed. Even in a lot of the puzzle guides which existed, they're just these weird sort of word puzzles where players essentially end up randomly guessing until they stumble across a right answer. Which I, for one, never really felt was particularly satisfying. They just sort of fell flat most of the time. And whilst I do love a good riddle, unless the answer to the riddle is death, time, or a river, or maybe a clock, then there's no real guarantee that your players are going to have those contextual clues to come up with the answer. Because that's the problem with riddles. They're so specialist to a certain answer and to a certain experience that if your players just aren't in the exact same mindset as you when you wrote it, then frankly they're never going to get it, and it just turns into this random game of, well, what's the least amount of hints I can give before they eventually just sort of stumble upon the answer. And my favourite example of absolute nonsense riddle making comes from Samson. If you are familiar with the story, you're banned from guessing for an answer. But for those unfamiliar, essentially Samson goes to a wedding and as part of a competition gives out a riddle, which is out of the eater came something to eat, and out of the strong came something sweet. Did you guess it? The answer's obvious. It's a lion with a bee's nest inside of it, which Samson happened to see on his way to the wedding. Yeah. Imagine they're giving that to your players. Because the thing is, when you're writing a story, the character can answer the riddle whenever you want them to. At the end of the day, the character isn't a real person who has to try and figure out this riddle. You, as the writer, know the answer to the riddle, and it's up to you when they figure it out. As DMs, however, we don't have that same luxury. We have to consider that behind our PCs are players who do not know everything that we know. But here on the channel, I'm not all about endless negativity. So instead of just saying what I dislike about puzzles, I'm really going to go into how I think you should go about making good puzzles for your players that are both challenging and satisfying. Starting off with something that I think is really important when considering puzzles is, why do they even exist? There's a reason why medieval castles didn't have a secret door on the side that let you in to attack everyone if you managed to figure out the answer to a children's cracker riddle. And whilst I think you need to justify the existence of the puzzle in your own world, so I'm not going to go too much into it, one of the examples I always like is a testing ground. So potentially one I used in my campaign recently was within a dwarven forge, there was a location in which dwarven smiths would go to test their metal. Literally. And which it has since become infested with demons. This meant the players would not only have to go through the puzzles and rigmarole of facing the challenges of a dwarven smith, they would also need to fight off demons whilst doing so. But that's just one example. There's loads of ways of justifying puzzles, so don't think about it too much, and if you want to just include it because it's fun, that's also completely fine. So anyway, on to the actual puzzle making itself. So this might be controversial, but I don't think puzzles themselves should be particularly challenging. At least in most TTRPGs, and especially D&D, which isn't necessarily built around puzzles. Realistically, players should be able to solve puzzles either through trial and error or by simple multiple choice, and then just repetition until they're able to solve the issue. This is twofold. One, this is because, well, if you put a brick wall in front of the players that they have to cross, and they simply can't think of the answer, you will trap them in place. And once again, we end up with this situation where players just sort of end up randomly guessing answers until they stumble across the correct one. And number two, I don't think puzzles should be necessarily challenging because of what they are. They should be challenging by the environment that they are in. Let me explain. In fact, better yet, let me give you some examples. Your players stand in a large puzzle room. There are 4 rods in this room, or at least how many players you happen to have, 1 for each player. Anyway. Now, as an action, a player may activate a rod. If all 4 rods are activated, the door out of the room opens. But each rod resets after 6 seconds. Meaning, essentially, players will get 1 round to exit the door before the door locks shut behind them. Now, the rods can be somewhat difficult to access. Maybe one is surrounded by general wear and tear, maybe holes, maybe one is slightly degraded or moved slightly further away. I know when I did this with my players, I had one of the rods 65 feet away from the door, meaning even if a player dashed, they wouldn't be able to make it. Meaning players had to get creative for exactly how they managed to do this. But overall, this isn't a massive challenge. At the end of the day, knowing to press a rod even without instructions is really something you might find in a kid's game. It's not difficult. So instead, we place additional challenges that make it difficult. And in this situation, the room was filled with an ever-increasing number of demons. The challenge itself isn't the puzzle. The challenge is figuring out a way of activating all 4 rods and escaping through the door whilst dealing with large numbers of enemy combatants, which will also get in the way as you try to escape. The puzzle itself is not the challenge. The challenge is what surrounds it. Or perhaps there's an area in a dungeon where made up of, say, like a 10 by 10 grid. The only way to unlock the door on the other side and to advance is to step on every single square. If you repeat, the grid resets and you have to start again from scratch. Minus a couple of jumpings and diagonal moves, again, this isn't much of a challenge. What makes this a challenge are the large numbers of harpies dive bombing the players. If the players stand still for too long or step on a square they've already stepped on, they get locked out and the puzzle resets. Additionally, they have to push further upwards to make sure that they are not left behind when the puzzle is completed. Or perhaps your players are in a giant mechanical clockwork device. They must activate gears to turn them so they can access new areas and to advance through. However, each of the gears is protected by automaton long since corroded by time. These automatons attack anything nearby. Players must make sure to only activate the cogs in a certain way to avoid being swamped by enemies. This provides additional fun that they could potentially use the cogs to even crush potential enemies, avoiding them altogether and having that bit of a satisfying moment for both player and DM. All of these provide interesting scenarios to your players and challenges that they have to overcome without ever providing a stone wall to them. There's always ways to advance and players aren't stuck around not doing anything for ages. Additionally, if you're ever stuck for ideas or think that coming up with puzzles is too hard or too challenging, well, those last 2 ideas that I just gave you were both stolen from Pokemon games. At the end of the day, reuse what you know and what is available to you to make challenges for your players, and no one will notice. Unless, of course, you say it on your YouTube channel. Hey, I did say these puzzles could be solved by kids. Now, these combat-orientated puzzles, I think, are best suited to games like Dungeons & Dragons. It doesn't necessarily handle puzzles particularly well. And although I've given some examples, there are still things you need to be careful of, like players potentially being stuck behind an impossible wall, slowly being overwhelmed by opponents. So after spending almost 10 minutes talking about why you shouldn't do just riddles in your D&D games, I'm now talking about how you can do riddles in your D&D game. Because I'm like that. Because I'm not saying that they never work. I just think they require a lot more work for you, the DM, to make sure that they hit just right. But this isn't to say you should never include riddle-style puzzles in your games. I just think you need to be careful with them. And I think for the best example of when I've implemented a riddle-style puzzle that I think worked really well, we're going to go back to that Dwarven Forge that I mentioned at the beginning of the video, and the puzzle that I added into this to test my players and make sure they were paying attention. But before I can talk about the puzzle itself, I do need to talk about the world building that went into it. And bear with me as we go through a section that I will call Storytime with Beardy. Within the dwarven hold of Carcomas sits the legendary forges of the Rumnaheims. The Rumnaheims are a great family of smiths that have lived for thousands of years and have unlocked the secrets to the greatest metals and the greatest forgers in all dwarven kind. Their steel arms and armour are prized throughout the world, and the human kingdoms of Wulfgard and Tengria both pay very handsomely for these legendary armours and weapons. But the Rumnaheims covet something far greater than simple steel. They covet the secrets of Dwarven bronze. Dwarven bronze is the near mythical material that brought the height of Dwarven power thousands of years ago. However, after the collapse of the Great Dwarven Underground Empire, the secrets of Dwarven bronze were lost. Since then, untold numbers of Dwarven smiths and rune masters have spent their extended lives trying to uncover the secrets to this mythical material. But none have ever been successful. And it is within one of these forges that the party find themselves, having to undergo the trials of the smiths. However, the trial rooms have become infested with demons. After fighting through a couple of rooms, the party comes face to face with a new challenge, a plinth. Carved into the plinth's surface, there are 4 holes, and there are these words in Dwarvish. Weirdly, as well, most of my players spoke and wrote Dwarvish for no particular reason, so this was fine for me. But just bear languages in mind for your from your party if you are going to use this style of puzzle. Anyway, born from the earth in our abundant homes, to our most precious triumph we must regain, to reclaim what was lost, which is ours by right. Besides the plinth are 4 rune stones, each one engraved with 3 different runes, and a number corresponding to each of the holes within the plinth. As you are probably with my players, they assumed very correctly that each block lined up with a certain hole within the plinth. They simply had to figure out which one went where. Fortunately, because most of my players wrote and read Dwarvish, they knew what the runes meant. Unfortunately, they only knew the literal translations of the runes rather than what they meant more culturally. Meaning my players will have to figure out the literal translations of these runes and then figure out where they went within the puzzle. On the first block, there was a rune which translated to tall wooded expanse, another jutting stone fortress, and cloudy abode of the gods. On the second block was sunset ore, coal burnt iron, and firelight gem. On the third, captured sea gem, black veined stone, and soft moon ore. And on the last, authoritative doctrine, pick chipper gems, and give renown to the ancestors. Now, if you do want to try this puzzle for real, feel free to pause the video if you want and see if you can figure it out. Give me your guesses in the comments below if you did get which side went into which hole. I really need to be careful with what I say on here. Now, there were a couple of things that I did when I made this puzzle. The first thing I did is I made the first answer particularly easy. This gave an idea to the players exactly what they needed to do, allowed them to get some experience with it before they were then able to give the harder answers a bit more thought. So, for example, on rune block 1, you have tall wooded expanse, which means forest, jutting stone fortress, which is a mountain, and cloudy abode of the gods is the sky. Now, lining up with what it says on the plinth, we know dwarves like living in mountains, so that must be the answer to question 1. Now, we will slightly skip ahead to part 4, which talks about what the dwarves have lost and what is rightfully theirs. With the most important thing to them is trying to reclaim the glory of the past, which is why they put so much work into their dwarven bronze. So now my players are faced with somewhat of a challenge. There are 2 holes left, 2 blocks to put into those holes, but only 1 line of text remaining. So here comes the second part of what I think makes a good riddle in D&D. It has to have an in-universe answer. And the third part, I did not shut up about Dwarven Bronze. Even in this video, I've mentioned it 4 or 5 times. In game, when the players first entered, they passed rooms where they were trying to forge Dwarven Bronze. They met the Rune Master in this grand hall filled with aspirants and apprentices trying to make the metal. The whole reason they were here is that one of the characters' fathers had been trying to make it. This material had been mentioned on and on and on, and my players very quickly realised that one of the answers to this riddle simply had to be Dwarven Bronze. But this still gave the problem that there were 2 holes and 2 potential answers. And this is where my reputation as being a very meticulous DM really helped, because my players looked at this and went, well, Dwarven Bronze could be sunset ore. But there's absolutely no way that Beardy would refer to bronze as an ore. He's far too much of a to do that. So my players came up with the right solution that the answers to the middle were copper and tin, the 2 components of bronze. And this puzzle was a lot. I put a lot of work in to make sure my players had the cultural context to understand what riddle they were walking into before I gave it to them. This riddle was planned sessions in advance. I'd literally put hours of work into making a riddle that my players I knew could understand but would still be challenging. And in reality, they solved it within 20 minutes or half an hour. Was it worth it? I think so. It was a lot of fun. But, when I'm thinking about other projects I'm doing and other things I've got to plan for, it was a lot of work. But they also did it with basically no input from me. I was able to sit back and just smile as they worked their way through my puzzle. So, yeah, this probably was worth it for me as a DM, and it's something my players do still talk about. Looking at all this, my advice for any DM wanting to add puzzles into their games, I would definitely go for the combat puzzles. I think they're easier to manage, they're rewarding for players, and that's really what we're looking for at the end of the day. And if you've got a few hours to spare and you want to make up a long in-world puzzle, then you go for it. But you need to make sure you put in that work. But yeah, this video has been a lot longer than all my others. I think about twice as long. But I had a lot of things to talk about, and I hope you enjoyed the examples that I gave when talking about puzzles that you might want to use in your own games. Will all my videos from now on be this long? No, probably not. I'll probably try and stick to about the 10-minute mark, because I think that's most comfortable for me to do in these time frames. But yeah, let me know what you thought below, and if you're not subscribed, do so. I always feel weird saying that still, but hey oh. And I still don't know how to end these things. So I guess until next time, I've been the Bearded Halfling, and thank you for listening.